I'm sitting here witnessing something truly astonishing unfold in real time. Oil prices have just surged past $100 a barrel. This spike isn't due to a hurricane or a pipeline explosion. It stems from a political miscalculation that has gone horribly wrong. And the people who are paying the price are not the ones who made this decision. What I'm about to explain in the next few minutes will fundamentally alter your understanding of what's currently happening in the Middle East. This is not the narrative the White House wants you to believe, nor is it the version being presented on cable news. This is the real story, one that is playing out in oil markets, intelligence briefings, and the Strait of Hormuz, where the entire global economy has effectively become a hostage. Stay with me, because things are going to get worse before they get better. If you haven't subscribed to Sarah Mitchell's YouTube channel yet, do it now. Hit that button because the markets will open in just hours, and what I'm about to walk you through will matter in ways that extend far beyond your newsfeed. Let's go back 72 hours, as that's where this all began. Not with a missile strike or a tweet, but with a silence that should have served as a warning, but did not. Rewind to the moment when the United States launched strikes against Iran's supreme leadership. The administration's theory was straightforward: decapitate the leadership, watch the system collapse, see moderates rise, and ultimately witness the regime fall from within. That was the concept of regime change being discussed in the Situation Room. However, the intelligence community had a different perspective. Reports citing U.S. intelligence assessments indicated that analysts clearly warned the president, regime change is not happening. The Revolutionary Guard remains intact. The clerics are still in power. The mid-level bureaucrats who actually run the Iranian state are still in place. Taking out the supreme leader did not spark a revolution, it ignited a crackdown. Now, a cornered Iran, facing bombardment from both the United States and Israel, has made a decision that is sending shockwaves through every energy market worldwide. Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz. Say that name slowly because you'll be hearing it frequently in the near future. Approximately 20% of the world's oil passes through this strategic waterway. Every tanker, every supertanker, every shipment moving from the Persian Gulf to Europe, Asia, and the United States navigates this narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman. Iran's new leadership has made it abundantly clear they intend to turn that strait into a parking lot, a blockade, a choke point that doesn't just slow oil shipments, it stops them entirely. This is not merely a threat, it is the strategy, and it is effective. Here's what you need to understand about Iran's actual power. It is not its navy, nor is it solely its missile program, though that is significant. It is not even its drones, which have already targeted 20 different American and allied military bases across the region. Iran's true weapon, the one that gives it leverage over a global superpower, is geography. It sits on the most strategically critical waterway in the world, and right now, it is threatening to turn off the tap. That's not a military metaphor. It's the mechanism of a global recession. Announcement number one hit the markets like a freight train. 37 allied nations, countries that have endured months of tariff threats, diplomatic insults, and economic pressure from the current administration, rushed to the United States' rescue. Collectively, they coordinated the release of 400 million barrels of oil from their strategic reserves. The United States added an additional 172 million barrels from its own strategic petroleum reserve. That's 600 million barrels of oil flooding the market simultaneously. You know what that did to oil prices? They went up. Stop and read that again. 600 million barrels of emergency oil released onto the market, marking the largest coordinated strategic reserve drawdown in history. And yet, oil prices rose. As of the time of this recording, crude is nearing $100 a barrel. According to analysts at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, that number is not a ceiling, it is a threshold. If prices cross it sustainably, we could start to see domino effects. Airline ticket prices will surge, trucking costs will explode, and grocery prices, already at historic highs, will climb again. The strategic reserve release was meant to calm the markets, but instead, it sent a signal so alarming that traders responded by buying oil futures at even higher prices. Why? Because 600 million barrels were not enough to fill the void. The market has already priced in what happens if the Strait of Hormuz goes dark, and the number they're pricing in is not $100 a barrel, it's much higher. According to Reuters, oil analysts at major investment banks are now wargaming scenarios where sustained disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz push crude prices to between $140 and $160 per barrel within 60 days. Goldman Sachs even issued an emergency note to clients with a subject line that simply read, "Brace now." Now, let's move on to announcement number 2, which is the part the administration hasn't quite figured out how to explain yet. Before the escalation of hostilities with Iran, economic data for February was already alarming. The February jobs report, covering the period before direct hostilities escalated, showed zero net job creation. Depending on how you interpret the revisions, there was actually a loss of approximately 90,000 jobs. The Bureau of Labor Statistics confirmed this headline number, and economists across the political spectrum noted that when these figures are revised, typically 3 to 4 months later, they tend to worsen, not improve. Inflation as of February was running at 3.1% year over year at the grocery store level, compared to the already elevated levels of the previous February. In practical terms, what you could buy for a basket of groceries 2 years ago now costs you significantly more. And that was before the conflict with Iran added a 9% spike in crude oil prices in a single day. Do you want to know what an 8.6% increase in oil costs in one day does to a grocery store supply chain? It doesn't show up immediately. It manifests quietly over the next 3 to 5 weeks in the prices of everyday items: bread, milk, chicken, anything transported by truck, which is essentially everything. The inflationary wave from this energy shock hasn't hit consumer prices yet, but it will. Consumer confidence, already at a multi-year low according to the Conference Board's latest reading, is about to take another hit. And here's the cruel irony. The president, who campaigned explicitly on reducing prices, is overseeing an oil shock that will raise costs for every single item in every American household. Now, let's delve into what's really happening within the Iranian calculus, because this is the part that the mainstream press is failing to connect properly. The theory behind the American strikes was borrowed from a playbook that has never worked: bomb your way to a political outcome. Eliminate the leadership, destabilize the chain of command, and hope moderates fill the vacuum. This is the same theory that led to the 2003 Iraq War, the same theory that resulted in the Mission Accomplished banner, and the same theory that, in every instance where it has been applied in the modern Middle East, has produced not stability, but a more dangerous and radical successor. Iran's new supreme leadership observed what happened when the previous leader was removed and drew a rational conclusion. The only way to protect yourself from becoming the next target is to make the cost of targeting you too high to bear. Not through military victory. Iran has no illusions about winning a head-to-head fight with the United States, but through economic cost, through the mechanism of the Strait of Hormuz. By imposing a global recession on the United States and its allies faster than any military retaliation can respond. This is not a nation backed into a corner acting irrationally. It is a nation backed into a corner acting with devastating strategic clarity. Consider the sequence of events. Iran has already struck 20 different American and allied military bases across the region, and Iraqi oil tankers are ablaze. The administration responded by appealing to its allies, the same allies it has spent years insulting, imposing tariffs on, and publicly humiliating, asking for assistance in releasing their strategic reserves. Those allies complied, and yet oil prices went up anyway. For those subscribed to Sarah Mitchell's YouTube channel, this is crucial. Hit the notification bell because the next 72 hours are likely to produce developments you need to witness in real time, not 12 hours later. Now, here's something that nobody is discussing, and it changes everything. The administration's public positioning has quietly shifted without a formal announcement or press conference. Back in June, when the United States targeted parts of Iran's nuclear program, the stated objective was clear: halt nuclear development, force regime change, and install a leadership willing to negotiate. That was the framework. But listen to what senior officials are saying now. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, in his most recent public statements, has reframed the objective. According to reporting by the Washington Post, confirmed by statements from the State Department, Rubio is now describing success as eliminating Iran's missile capability and degrading its naval assets. That's it. There's no longer any talk of regime change or installing new leadership. The goalposts have shifted not because the strategy succeeded, but because the original strategy failed. The intelligence community informed the president that regime change would not occur. The Revolutionary Guard has not collapsed, the clerical establishment has not fractured, and the moderates have not risen. Instead, what happened is that the new Ayatollah, facing aerial bombardment from the United States and Israel, consolidated power more quickly than anticipated, cracked down on dissent, and activated the one option that the administration clearly did not wargame adequately: control over the Strait of Hormuz. Now the administration is attempting to redefine what winning looks like in the midst of a conflict it can no longer fully control. That is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of catastrophic miscalculation. But here's what's really driving this, and I want you to think about this carefully. Before the escalation with Iran, the president's approval ratings were in freefall, not just dipping, but plummeting. According to aggregated polling from 538 and Gallup, the approval number was on track to drop below 30%, a level not seen since the darkest moments of any modern presidency. The data behind that number is even worse than the headline suggests. Young voters under 30, who had previously shown movement toward the administration in the last election cycle, are now pulling away dramatically. Independents, the group that decides every national election, have consistently moved away from the administration for months. Hispanic voters, a demographic the administration explicitly targeted and made gains with, are showing significant erosion. Meanwhile, consumer confidence among working-class households, the very demographic this presidency was built upon, is declining as grocery prices and energy costs continue to rise. By every metric, the president was losing the argument at home, not just on a single issue, but across the entire spectrum. There is an old playbook for moments like this, and historians have a name for it: rallying the flag. The theory is simple. When a leader's domestic position becomes untenable, military action abroad consolidates support, suppresses criticism, and reframes the national conversation around patriotism and security rather than groceries and jobs. The problem is that this playbook has never worked in the long run for any modern American president, especially when the underlying domestic conditions like inflation, stagnant wages, and high prices do not improve. You cannot bomb your way out of the political consequences of economic failure. Any approval rating bump from military action, if it occurs at all, is temporary. The grocery prices remain high, and the polling data from the past 16 months makes this clearer than anything the administration's critics could say. Since January of last year, there have been approximately 270 competitive races at state and federal levels across the country. Democrats have outperformed their previous benchmarks in 240 of them, not one, but all of them. This means that in race after race, across various regions, demographics, and local conditions, voters have moved toward Democratic candidates at rates higher than they supported the Democratic presidential candidate in the previous cycle. In this period, 28 seats have flipped from Republican to Democrat in Congress, and 9 additional seats have gone Democratic from Republican in state legislatures. The number of seats that have switched the other way, from Democrat to Republican, is 0. That is not a polling artifact. That is America voting. It is the electorate sending a clear message in the only language democracy allows. We are unhappy. We know what has changed, and we are acting accordingly. Now, with a war that is spiking oil prices, straining military logistics, and producing civilian casualties, including reports from multiple international human rights organizations and confirmed by Associated Press correspondents on the ground of children being killed in strikes, where the intelligence targeting was later found to be inaccurate. The political environment is one that no military escalation can remedy. Let's discuss what this means specifically for you, because this is not an abstract issue. This situation is not just some distant geopolitics happening in a room you'll never enter. It's unfolding in your gas tank, in your grocery cart, and in your retirement account. If you work in sectors like transportation, trucking, logistics, delivery, or airlines, you're about to feel the impact of this crisis. Fuel surcharges are already being recalculated by carriers across the country. According to the American Trucking Association, every penny increase in diesel fuel costs the industry approximately $393 million annually. With oil prices up nearly 9% in a single day, do the math. If you have a 401k or investment account, check it today and then again at the end of the week. Energy sector stocks are soaring. Companies like Marathon Petroleum, Valero, and Phillips 66 are seeing significant gains as crude prices rise. However, broader market indices are under pressure. The S&P 500 has absorbed substantial volatility, and every analyst on Wall Street is now wargaming scenarios where sustained conflict and disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz lead to a demand shock, followed by an inflationary spiral. This would result in a Federal Reserve that cannot cut interest rates because inflation is reaccelerating. If you live in a region where manufacturing is the economic backbone, like the Midwest, parts of the South, or the industrial corridors of the Northeast, supply chain disruptions from an energy shock of this magnitude will hit your local economy. Not in 6 months, but in weeks. Manufacturers factor energy costs into everything they produce, and those costs are now being repriced in real time. If you're just an everyday person who drives a car, buys food, and pays utility bills, you will definitely notice these changes. Not because someone decided to make your life harder, but because of a political decision made in Washington based on a flawed theory about how Iran would respond. The cost of that mistake is being distributed across every American household simultaneously. This isn't a partisan issue, it's basic arithmetic. While all of this is happening domestically, let's take a step back because the international dimension of this conflict is being dramatically underreported, and it completely alters the strategic landscape. Those 37 countries that released oil from their strategic reserves? Think about what that represents. These nations have spent the last 2+ years absorbing tariff threats, diplomatic pressure, public insults, and economic coercion from the current administration. Countries like Canada, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the European Union collectively, these nations were told they were free riders, publicly mocked, and had their trade relationships used as leverage to extract concessions. Yet, when the United States called for help, they responded. Now, ask yourself why. It's not because these relationships were warm. They weren't. It's not because they trusted the administration's strategic judgment. They demonstrably do not. Multiple European foreign ministers have stated this on the record, as reported by the BBC and other outlets. They came to assist because they recognized something that the American public is only beginning to understand. A blockade of the Strait of Hormuz and a global oil shock would hurt them profoundly. The calculus of allowing the United States to endure a catastrophic energy crisis alone, with all the geopolitical instability that would follow, was worse than swallowing their grievances and releasing their reserves. That is not alliance. That is mutual survival arithmetic. Here's the chilling part. Even that collective act of goodwill, nations with genuine reasons to step back choosing to step forward, was not enough to stabilize oil markets. This tells you something important about the scale of what is at stake in the strait. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the situation looks entirely different. China is Iran's largest oil customer. According to data from the International Energy Agency, China imports approximately 90% of its Iranian crude at heavily discounted prices through sanctions evasion arrangements. A disruption in the Strait of Hormuz does indeed hurt China's energy supply, but it also dramatically increases the global price of alternative supplies that China would need to purchase, which impacts every other major industrial economy more than it affects China. Why? Because China has been building energy storage and alternative supply relationships for years, specifically to hedge against scenarios like this. China is not going to intervene militarily, but it doesn't need to. Its leverage is diplomatic and economic. It is the one major power with open lines of communication to Tehran, significant economic exposure on both sides, and a demonstrated willingness to let American strategic overreach exhaust itself. As reported by Bloomberg's Beijing bureau, Chinese foreign ministry officials have quietly conveyed to their counterparts in Tehran that Beijing will not publicly condemn Iran's posture in the strait while simultaneously communicating to Washington that a diplomatic resolution is preferable to further escalation. That is not neutrality. That is a calculated positioning by a power that understands it stands to gain from prolonged American entanglement in a conflict it cannot resolve quickly. And then there's Russia. Russia's energy revenues, which have been under pressure from Western sanctions and price caps, improve with every dollar that crude oil rises. At $100 a barrel, Russia's fiscal position stabilizes. At $120, it begins to recover. At $140, the sanctions regime intended to constrain Russian military capacity becomes significantly less effective because the revenue it was designed to cut is now flowing again from buyers who are not subject to Western sanctions and are willing to pay for oil. The war with Iran, regardless of its original intent, has resulted in an energy market structure that benefits Russia, not because Russia engineered it, but because it's the logical consequence of disrupting the global energy supply at a time when Russia is one of the few major producers outside the affected zone. These are not coincidences. They're the mechanical outcomes of the strategic situation as it actually exists, and none of these factors were part of the administration's public theory when this operation began. Now, let's examine where this situation may lead, because I see two distinct paths. There is no comfortable middle ground here. The situation has moved beyond the point where a press conference can fix things. Path 1 involves de-escalation through back-channel negotiation. This is not impossible. Iran has indicated through intermediaries, including Omani diplomats, who have historically served as a discreet back-channel between Washington and Tehran, that there is a framework for ceasefire discussions. The core terms, according to reporting from The Guardian and Al Monitor, involve halting airstrikes, committing not to pursue regime change, and establishing a framework for eventual discussions on sanctions relief. From Iran's perspective, the condition is that the United States must publicly acknowledge, either directly or through diplomatic language, that the strategy of assassination-driven regime change has been abandoned. From the administration's perspective, it would need to publicly walk back language used by the president himself in multiple statements. That is a significant political ask. Whether the political will exist to make that concession, given the current domestic political climate, remains an open question. If this path is pursued, oil prices could retreat toward $80 a barrel within 30 days. The military posture would de-escalate, and the Strait of Hormuz would reopen to normal traffic. The economic shock would be painful but survivable. I want to believe this is the path we're on, but just 3 days ago, I thought the strategic reserve release would calm oil markets, and then oil prices went up. Path 2 is a downward spiral, and it's an ugly scenario. In this case, Iran activates full disruption of the Strait of Hormuz, not just the partial signaling disruptions we've seen so far, but a sustained, enforced blockade using naval assets and mining. Global oil markets would reprice to $130, $140, or even $150 per barrel. Every allied nation that just released its strategic reserves to assist the United States would now face its own energy crisis. The coalition that helped would begin to fracture under domestic political pressure. China, which has quietly benefited from discounted Iranian oil and has significant economic interests in preventing the strait from going dark, would enter the diplomatic equation, but not necessarily on America's side. Meanwhile, Russia, already isolated from Western energy markets, would find its global leverage increasing as the world scrambles for any available supply. The Federal Reserve would be faced with an impossible choice: combat re-accelerating inflation by keeping interest rates high or cut rates to support a slowing economy. It cannot do both. The result would be stagflation, the worst possible combination of slow growth and high prices, akin to the conditions not seen in the United States since the 1970s. As midterm elections approach in this environment, The political math becomes brutal. Nobody wins in this scenario. Not the administration, not Iran, which is enduring devastating military damage, not the global economy, and not the countries dependent on Persian Gulf energy flows. Not the American families trying to figure out why their grocery bills keep rising. Everyone suffers. That is the second path. Here's what I know, and I want to be precise about what I know versus what I'm analyzing. The economic data is not in dispute. Zero net job creation in February, inflation at 3.1% year over year on groceries, and oil up 8.6% in a single day, despite the largest coordinated strategic reserve release in history. 20% of global oil passes through a strait that Iran has explicitly threatened to blockade. The political data is also not in dispute. Approval ratings were declining before the conflict, and Democrats have outperformed in 240 of 270 competitive races. There have been 28 seat flips in one direction and 0 in the other. The strategic miscalculation is also not in dispute. The intelligence community's assessment, no regime change, was delivered to the president before escalation. The objectives have since been publicly revised downward. What remains in dispute is the outcome, and that outcome is being decided right now in back-channel conversations among diplomats in the Strait of Hormuz, in oil trading rooms in London, Singapore, and New York, and in the homes of American families watching their purchasing power erode in real time. Before I conclude, subscribe to Sarah Mitchell's YouTube channel if you want to follow this situation as it develops. I'll be updating this story regularly because the next 72 hours are critical. The markets will move, diplomatic signals will shift, and you need to be watching this with the right framework, not the one being offered by those who have a stake in how you interpret it. Hit the like button if this analysis made sense to you. Leave a comment below. I want to know your thoughts. Do you think the administration genuinely believed the regime change theory would work, or was it always about something else? I want to hear what you think. I read every single comment. Now, consider these questions. Is this president trying to protect American interests in the Middle East, or is he focused on preserving his approval ratings? Those are two very different objectives, and the strategy you would pursue for one looks nothing like the strategy you would pursue for the other. Is Iran the aggressor here, or is it a nation that has been bombed, had its leadership targeted, and is now leveraging the only real power it possesses? Your answer to that question will shape your understanding of what a resolution looks like. And here's the one that keeps me awake at night. When the dust settles, whether it takes 3 months or 3 years, which country emerges structurally stronger? The one that controls the strait, or the one that has just discovered that its allies will help it release emergency oil reserves, only to see prices rise anyway? I don't have a clean answer to that last question, and anyone who tells you they do is selling something. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them.